The Memoirs of General William Tecumseh Sherman. Chapter 1. From 1820 to the Mexican War, or 1820 to 1846. According to Cawthron in his History of Ancient Woodbury, Connecticut, the Sherman family came from Dedham, Essex County, England. The first recorded name is of Edmund Sherman, with his 3 sons, Edmund, Samuel, and John, who were at Boston before 1636. And further, it is distinctly recorded that Honorable Samuel Sherman, Reverend John, his brother, and Captain John, his first cousin, arrived from Dedham, Essex County, England, in 1634. Samuel afterward married Sarah Mitchell, who had come, in the same ship, from England, and finally settled at Stratford, Connecticut. The other 2 Johns, located at Watertown, Massachusetts. From Captain John Sherman are descended Roger Sherman, the signer of the Declaration of Independence, Honorable William M. Evarts, the Misters Hoare of Massachusetts, and many others of national fame. Our own family are descended from the Honorable Samuel Sherman and his son, the Reverend John, who was born in 1650-51. Then another John, born 1687, then Judge Daniel, born in 1721, then Taylor Sherman, our grandfather, who was born in 1758. Taylor Sherman was a lawyer and a judge in Norwalk, Connecticut, where he resided until his death, May 4th, 1815, leaving a widow, Betsy Stoddard Sherman, and 3 children, Charles R., our father, Daniel, and Betsy. When the state of Connecticut, in 1786, ceded to the United States her claim to the western part of her public domain, as defined by her royal charter, she reserved a large district in what is now northern Ohio, a portion of which, 500,000 acres, composed the Fireland District, which was set apart to indemnify the parties who had lost property in Connecticut by the raids of Generals Arnold, Tryon, and others during the latter part of the Revolutionary War. Our grandfather, Judge Taylor Sherman, was one of the commissioners appointed by the state of Connecticut to quiet the Indian title, and to survey and subdivide this Fireland District, which includes the present counties of Huron and Erie. In his capacity as commissioner, he made several trips to Ohio in the early part of this century, and it is supposed that he had then contracted the disease which proved fatal. For his labor and losses he received a title to 2 sections of land, which fact was probably the prime cause of the migration of our family to the West. My father received a good education and was admitted to the bar at Norwalk, Connecticut, where, in 1810, he, at 20 years of age, married Mary Hoyt, also of Norwalk, and at once migrated to Ohio, leaving his wife, my mother, for a time. His first purpose was to settle at Zanesville, Ohio, but he finally chose Lancaster, Fairfield County, where he at once engaged in the practice of his profession. In 1811 he returned to Norwalk, where, meantime, was born Charles Taylor Sherman, the eldest of the family, who, with his mother, was carried to Ohio on horseback. Judge Taylor Sherman's family remained in Norwalk till 1815, when his death led to the emigration of the remainder of the family, viz. our Uncle Daniel Sherman, who settled at Monroeville, Ohio, as a farmer, where he'd lived and died quite recently, leaving children and grandchildren, and an Aunt Betsy, who married Judge Parker of Mansfield and died in 1851, leaving children and grandchildren. Also grandmother Elizabeth Stoddard Sherman, who resided with her daughter, Mrs. Betsy Parker, in Mansfield until her death, August 1st, 1848. Thus my father, Charles R. Sherman, became finally established at Lancaster, Ohio, as a lawyer, with his own family in the year 1811, and continued there till the time of his death, in 1829. I have no doubt that he was in the first instance attracted to Lancaster by the natural beauty of its scenery, and the charms of its already established society. He continued in the practice of his profession, which in those days was no sinecure, for the ordinary circuit was made on horseback, and embraced Marietta, Cincinnati, and Detroit. Hardly was the family established there when the War of 1812 caused great alarm and distress in all Ohio. The English captured Detroit and the shores of Lake Erie down to the Maumee River, while the Indians still occupied the greater part of the state. Nearly every man had to be somewhat of a soldier, but I think my father was only a commissary. Still, he seems to have caught a fancy for the great chief of the Shawnees, Tecumseh. Perry's victory on Lake Erie was the turning point of the Western campaign, and General Harrison's victory over the British and Indians at the River Thames in Canada ended the war in the West, and restored peace and tranquility to the exposed settlers in Ohio. My father at once resumed his practice at the bar, and was soon reorganized as an able and successful lawyer. When, in 1816, my brother James was born, he insisted on engrafting the Indian name Tecumseh on the usual family list. My mother had already named her first son after her own brother Charles, and insisted on the second son taking the name of her other brother James, and when I came along on the 8th of February 1820, mother having no more brothers, my father succeeded in his original purpose, and named me William Tecumseh. The family rapidly increased till it embraced 6 boys and 5 girls, all of whom attained maturity and married. Of these 6 are still living. In the year 1821, a vacancy occurred in the Supreme Court of Ohio, and I find this petition. Somerset, Ohio, July 6, 1821. May it please your Excellency, we ask leave to recommend to your Excellency's favorable notice Charles R. Sherman, Esquire, of Lancaster, as a man possessing in an eminent degree those qualifications so much to be desired in a judge of the Supreme Court. From a long acquaintance with Mr. Sherman, we are happy to be able to state to your Excellency that our minds are led to the conclusion that gentleman possesses a disposition noble and generous, a mind discriminating, comprehensive, and combining a heart pure, benevolent, and humane, manners dignified, mild, and complacent, and a firmness not to be shaken, and of unquestionable integrity. Well, Mr. Sherman's character cannot be unknown to your Excellency, but on the acquaintance, without further comment, we might safely rest his pretensions. We think we hazard little in assuring your Excellency that his appointment would be given almost universal satisfaction to the citizens of Perry County. With great consideration, we have the honor to be your Excellency's most obedient, humble servants. Signed, Charles A. Hood, George Treat, Peter Ditto, P. Audlin, J. B. Orton, T. Beckwith, William P. Dorst, John Murray, Jacob Mons, B. Eaton, Daniel Griggs, Henry Ditto, Nicholas McCarty. His Excellency Ethan A. Brown, Governor of Ohio, Columbus. He was soon after appointed a judge on the Supreme Court, and served in that capacity to the day of his death. My memory extends back to about 1827, and I recall him returning home on horseback, when all the boys used to run and contend for the privilege of riding his horse from the front door back to the stable. On one occasion I was the first, and being mounted rode to the stable, but old Dick was impatient because the stable door was not opened promptly, so he started for the barn of our neighbor Mr. King. There, also, no one was in waiting to open the gate, and, after a reasonable time, Dick started back for home somewhat in a hurry, and threw me among a pile of stones in front of Preacher Wright's house, where I was picked up apparently a dead boy, but my time was not yet, and I recovered, though the scars remain to this day. The year 1829 was a sad one to our family. We were then 10 children, my eldest brother Charles absent at State University, Athens, Ohio, my brother James in a store at Cincinnati, and the rest were at home at school. Father was away on the circuit. One day Jane Sturgeon came to the school, called us out, and when we reached home all was lamentation. News had come that our father was ill unto death at Lebanon, 100 miles away. Mother started at once, by coach, but met the news of his death about Washington, and returned home. He had ridden on horseback from Cincinnati to Lebanon to hold court, during a hot day in June. On the next day he took his seat on the bench, opened court in the forenoon, but in the afternoon after recess was seized with a severe chill, and had to adjourn the court. The best medical aid was called in, and for 3 days with apparent success, but the fever then assumed a more dangerous type, and he gradually yielded to it, dying on the 6th day, viz. June 24th, 1829. My brother James had been summoned from Cincinnati, and was present at his bedside, as was also Henry Stoddard, Esquire, of Dayton, Ohio, our cousin. Mr. Stoddard once told me that the cause of my father's death was cholera. But at the time, 1829, there was no Asiatic cholera in the United States, and the family attributed the death to exposure to the hot sun of June, and a consequent fever, typhoid. From the resolutions of the bench, bar, and public generally, now in my possession, his death was universally deplored, more especially by his neighbors in Lancaster and by the Society of Freemasons, of which he was the high priest of Arch Chapter No. 2. His death left the family very poor, but friends rose up with proffers of generous care and assistance, for all the neighbors knew what mother could not maintain so large a family without help. My eldest brother Charles had nearly completed his education at university at Athens and concluded to go to his uncle, Judge Parker, at Mansfield, Ohio, to study law. My eldest sister Elizabeth soon after married William J. Reese, Esquire. James was already in a store at Cincinnati, and with the exception of the 3 youngest children, the rest of us were scattered. I fell to the charge of the Honorable Thomas Ewing, who took me to his family, and ever after treated me as his own son. I continued at the academy in Lancaster, which was the best in the place. Indeed, as good a school as any in Ohio. We studied all the common branches of knowledge, including Latin, Greek, and French. At first, the school was kept by Mr. Parsons. He was succeeded by Mr. Brown, and he by 2 brothers, Samuel and Mark Howe. These were all excellent teachers, and we made good progress, first at the old academy and afterward at a new schoolhouse, built by Samuel Howe, in the orchard of Hugh Boyle, Esquire. Time passed with us, as with boys generally. Mr. Ewing was in the United States Senate, and I was notified to prepare for West Point, of which institution we had little knowledge except that it was very strict, and that the army was its natural consequence. In 1834 I was large for my age, and the construction of canals was the rage in Ohio. A canal was projected to connect with the great Ohio Canal at Carroll, 8 miles above Lancaster, down the valley of the Hockhocking to Athens, 44 miles, and then hence to the Ohio River by Slackwater. Preacher Carpenter, of Lancaster, was appointed to make the preliminary surveys, and selected the necessary working party out of the boys of the town. From our school were chosen Wilson, Emmanuel Giese, William King, and myself. Giese and I were the rodmen. We worked during the fall and next spring, marking 2 exceptional lines, and for our work we each received a silver $half for each day's actual work, the first money any of us have ever earned. In June 1835, one of our school fellows, William Irvin, was appointed a cadet to West Point, and as it required 16 years of age for admission, I had to wait another year. During the autumn of 1835 and the spring of 1836, I devoted myself chiefly to mathematics and French, which were known to be chief requisites for admission to West Point. Sometime in the spring of 1836, I received through Mr. Ewing, then at Washington, from the Secretary of War, Mr. Poinsett, the letter of appointment as a cadet, with a list of the articles of clothing necessary to be taken along, all of which were liberally provided by Mrs. Ewing, and with orders to report to Mr. Ewing at Washington by a certain date. I left Lancaster about the 20th of May in the stagecoach for Zanesville. There we transferred to the coaches of the great national road, the highway of travel from west to the east. The stages generally traveled in gangs of from 1 to 6 coaches, each drawn by 4 good horses carrying 9 passengers inside and 3 or 4 outside. In about 3 days' traveling, day and night, we reached Frederick, Maryland. There we were told that we could take rail cars to Baltimore, and thence to Washington. But there was also a 2-horse hack ready to start for Washington direct. Not having full faith in the novel and dangerous railroad, I stuck to the coach, and in the night reached Gadsby's Hotel in Washington City. The next morning I hunted up Mr. Ewing, and found him boarding with a mess of senators at Mrs. Hill's Corner on 3rd and C Streets, and transferred my trunk to the same place. I spent a week in Washington, and I think I saw more of that place in that time than I ever have since in the many years of residence there. General Jackson was president, and was the zenith of his fame. I recall looking at him at full hour one morning through the wood railing of Pennsylvania Avenue, as he paced up and down the gravel walk on the north front of the White House. He wore a cap and an overcoat so full that his form seemed smaller than I had expected. I also recalled the appearance of Postmaster General Amos Kendall, of Vice President Van Buren, Misters Calhoun, Webster, Clay, Cass, Silas Wright, etc. In due time, I took my departure for West Point with Cadets Belt and Brona. These were appointed cadets as from Ohio, although neither have ever seen that state. But in those days there were fewer applicants from Ohio than now, and near the close of the term the vacancies unasked for were usually filled from applicants on the spot. Neither of these parties, however, graduated, so the state of Ohio lost nothing. There took a boat up to the Havre de Grace, then the rail to Wilmington, Delaware, and up the Delaware in a boat to Philadelphia. I stayed over in Philadelphia one day at the old mansion house to visit the family of my brother-in-law, Mr. Reese. I found his father a fine sample of the old merchant gentleman in a good house in Arch Street, with his accomplished daughters who had been to Ohio, and whom I had seen there. From Philadelphia we took a boat to Bordentown, rail to the Amboy, and boat again to New York City, stopping at the American Hotel. I stayed a week in New York City, visiting my uncle Charles Hoyt at his beautiful place on Brooklyn Heights, and my uncle James, then living in White Street. My friend William Scott was there, the young husband of my cousin Louise Hoyt, who looked on me as an untamed animal just caught in the far west, fit food for gunpowder and good for nothing else. About June 12th I embarked on the steamer Cornelius Vanderbilt for West Point, registered in the office of Lieutenant C.F. Smith, adjutant of the Military Academy, as a new cadet on the class of 1836, and at once became installed as the plebe of many fellow townsmen, William Irvin, then entering his third class. Colonel R.E. de Russy was superintendent. Major John Fowle, 6th United States Infantry, commanded. The principal professors were Mahan, engineering; Bartlett, natural philosophy; Bailey, chemistry; Church, mathematics; Weir, drawing; and Berard, French. The routine of military training and of instruction was then fully established, and has remained almost the same ever since. To give a mere outline would swell this to an inconvenient size, and I therefore merely state that I went through the regular course of 4 years, graduating in June 1840, number 6 in a class of 43. These 43 were all that remained of more than 100 which originally constituted the class. At the academy I was not considered a good soldier, for at no time I was selected for any office, but remained a private throughout the whole 4 years. Then, as now, neatness in dress and form, with a strict conformity to rules, were the qualifications required for office, and I suppose I was found not to excel in any of these. In studies I always held a respectable reputation with the professors, and generally ranked among the best, especially in drawing, chemistry, mathematics, and natural philosophy. My average demerits per annum were about 150, which reduced my final class standing from number 4 to 6. In June 1840, after the final examination, the class graduated and we received our diplomas. Meantime, Major Delafield, United States Engineers, had become superintendent. Major C.F. Smith commanded of cadets, but the corps of professors and assistants remained almost unchanged during our whole term. We were all granted the usual furlough of 3 months and parted for our homes, there to await assignment to our respective corps and regiments. In due season, I was appointed and commissioned 2nd Lieutenant, 3rd Artillery, and ordered to report at Governor's Island, New York Harbor, at the end of September. I spent my furlough mostly at Lancaster and Mansfield, Ohio. Toward the close of the September, returned to New York, reported to Major Justin Dimmock, commanding the recruiting rendezvous at Governor's Island, and was assigned to command a company of recruits preparing for service in Florida. Early in October, this company was detailed as one of 4 to embark in a sailing vessel for Savannah, Georgia, under command of Captain and Brevet Major Penrose. We embarked and sailed, reaching Savannah about the middle of October, where we transferred to a small steamer and proceeded by the inland route to St. Augustine, Florida. We reached St. Augustine at the same time with the 8th Infantry, commanded by Colonel and Brevet Brigadier General William J. Worth. At that time, General Zachary Taylor was in chief command in Florida, and had his headquarters at Tampa Bay. My regiment, the 3rd Artillery, occupied the post along the Atlantic coast of Florida from St. Augustine south to Key Biscayne, and my own company, A, was at Fort Pierce, Indian River. At St. Augustine, I was detached from the company of recruits, which was designed for the 2nd Infantry, and was ordered to join my proper company at Fort Pierce. Colonel William Gates commanded the regiment, with Lieutenant William Austin Brown as an adjutant of the regiment. Lieutenant Bragg commanded the post of St. Augustine with his own company, E and G Gardeners, then commanded by Lieutenant Judd. In a few days I embarked in the little steamer William Gaston down the coast, stopping one day at New Smyrna, held by J.R. Vinton's company, B, with which was serving Lieutenant William H. Shover. In due season we arrived off the bar of Indian River and anchored. A whaleboat came off with a crew of 4 men, steered by a character of some note, known as the pilot Ashlock. I transferred self and baggage to this boat, and, with the mails, was carried through the surf over the bar into the mouth of the Indian River inlet. It was then dark. We transferred to a smaller boat, and the same crew pulled us up through a channel in the middle of Mangrove Islands, the roosting place of thousands of pelicans and birds that rose in clouds and circled above our heads. The water below was alive with fish, whose course through it could be seen by the phosphoric wake, and Ashlock told me many a tale of the Indian war then in progress, and of his adventures in hunting and fishing, which he described as the best in the world. About 2 miles from the bar we emerged into the lagoon, a broad expanse of shallow water that lies parallel with the coast, separated from it by a narrow strip of sand, backed by a continuous series of islands and promontories, covered with a dense growth of mangrove and saw palmetto. Pulling across this lagoon, in about 3 more miles, we approached the lights of Fort Pierce. Reaching a small wharf, we landed, and were met by the officers of the post, Lieutenant George Taylor and Edward J. Steptoe, and Assistant Surgeon James Simons. Taking the mail bag, we walked up a steep sand bluff on which the fort was situated, and across the parade ground to the officers' quarters. These were 6 or 7 log houses, thatched with palmetto leaves, built on high posts with a porch in front, facing the water. The men's quarters were also of logs, forming the 2 sides of a rectangle open towards the water. The intervals and the flanks were closed with log stockades. I was assigned to one of these rooms, and at once began service with my company, A, then commanded by Lieutenant Taylor. The season was hardly yet come for active operations against the Indians, so that the officers were naturally attracted to Ashlock, who was the best fisherman I ever saw. He soon initiated us into the mysteries of shark spearing, trolling for redfish, and taking the sheep's head and mullet. These abounded so that we could at any time catch an unlimited quantity at pleasure. The companies also owned nets for catching green turtles. These nets had meshes about a square foot, were set across channels in a lagoon, the ends secured to stakes driven into the mud, the lower line sunk with lead or stone weights, and the upper line floated with cork. We usually visited these nets twice a day, and found from 1 to 6 green turtles entangled in the meshes. Disengaging them, they were carried to pens, made with stakes stuck in the mud, where they were fed with mangrove leaves, and our cooks had at all times an ample supply of the best of green turtles. They were so cheap and common that the soldiers regarded it as an imposition when compelled to eat green turtle steaks, instead of poor Florida beef, or the usual barreled mess pork. I do not recall in my whole experience a spot on earth where fish, oysters, and green turtles so abound as at Fort Pierce, Florida. In November, Major Childs arrived with Lieutenant Van Vliet, and a detachment of recruits to fill our 2 companies, and preparations were at once begun for active operations in the field. At that time, the Indians in the peninsula of Florida were scattered, and the war consisted in hunting up and securing the small fragments to be sent to join the others of their tribe of Seminoles already established in the Indian Territory west of Arkansas. Our expeditions were mostly made in boats in the lagoons extending from the Hullover, near 200 miles above the fort, down to Jupiter Inlet, about 50 miles below, and in many streams which emptied therein. Many such expeditions were made during the winter, with more or less success, in which we succeeded in picking up small parties of men, women, and children. On one occasion near the Hull over, when I was not present, the expedition was more successful. It struck a party of nearly 50 Indians, killed several warriors, and captured others. In this expedition, my classmate, Lieutenant Van Villay, who was an excellent shot, killed a warrior who was running at full speed among the trees, and one of the sergeants of our company, Broderick, was said to have dispatched 3 warriors, and it was reported that he took the scalp of one and brought it into the fort as a trophy. Broderick was so elated that, on reaching the post, he had to celebrate his victory by a big drunk. There was, at the time, a poor, weakly soldier of our company whose wife cooked for our mess. She was somewhat of a flirt, and rather fond of admiration. Sergeant Broderick was attracted to her, and hung around the mess house more than the husband fancied, so he reported the matter to Lieutenant Taylor, who reproved Broderick for his behavior. A few days afterward the husband again appealed to his commanding officer, Taylor, who exclaimed, "Haven't you got a musket? Can't you defend your own family?" Very soon after, a shot was heard down by the mess house, and it had transpired about the husband had actually shot Broderick, inflicting a wound which proved mortal. The law and army regulations required that the man should be sent to the nearest civil court, which was at St. Augustine. Accordingly, the prisoner and necessary witnesses were sent up by the next monthly steamer. Among the latter were Lieutenant Taylor and the pilot Ashlock. After they had gone about a month, the sentinel on the rooftop of our quarters reported the smoke of a steamer approaching the bar, and, as I was acting quartermaster, I took a boat and pulled down to get the mail. I reached the log hut in which the pilots lived, and saw them start with their boat across the bar, board and steamer, and then return. Ashlock was at his old post at the steering oar, with 2 ladies who soon came to the landing, having passed through a very heavy surf, and I was presented to one as Mrs. Ashlock, and the other as her sister, a very pretty Minorcan girl of about 14 years of age. Mrs. Ashlock herself was about 18 or 20 years old, and a very handsome woman. I was hurriedly informed that the murder trial was in progress at St. Augustine, that Ashlock had given his testimony, and had availed himself of the chance to take a wife to share with him in solitude of his desolate hut on the beach on the Indian River. He had brought ashore his wife, her sister, and their chests, with the mail, and had orders to return immediately to the steamer, Gaston or Harney, to bring ashore some soldiers belonging to another company, Bragg's, which had been ordered from St. Augustine to Fort Pierce. Ashlock left his wife and her sister standing on the beach near the pilot hut, and started back his whale boat across the bar. I also took the mail and started up to the fort, and had hardly reached the wharf when I observed another boat following me. As soon as this reached the wharf, the men reported that Ashlock and all his crew, with the exception of one man, had been drowned a few minutes after I had left the beach. They said his surf boat had reached the steamer, had taken aboard a load of soldiers, some 8 or 10, and had started back through the surf when, on the bar, a heavy breaker upset the boat, and all were lost except the boy who pulled the bow oar, who clung to the rope or painter, hauled himself up to the upset boat, held on, drifted with it outside the breakers, and was finally beached near a mile down the coast. They reported also that the steamer had got up anchor, run in as close to the bar as she could, paused a while, and then had started down the coast. I instantly took a fresh crew of soldiers and returned to the bar. There sat poor Mrs. Whitlock on her chest of clothes, a weeping widow, who had seen her husband perish amid sharks and waves. She clung to the hope that the steamer had picked him up, but strange to say, he could not swim, although he had been employed on the water all of his life. Her sister was more demonstrative, and wailed as one lost to all hope and life. She appealed to us all to do miracles to save the struggling men in the waves, though 2 hours had already passed, and to have gone out then among those heavy breakers, with an experienced crew, would have been worse than suicide. All I could do was reorganize the guard at the beach, take the 2 desolate females up to the fort, and give them the use of my own quarters. Very soon their anguish quieted, and they began to look for the return of their steamer, with Ashlock and his rescued crew. The next day I went out again to the beach with Lieutenant Ord, and we found that 1 or 2 bodies had been washed ashore, torn all to pieces by the sharks, which literally swarmed the inlet at every new tide. In a few days the weather moderated, and the steamer returned from the south, but the surf was so high that she anchored a mile off. I went out myself, in the whale or surf boat, over that terrible bar with a crew of soldiers, boarded the steamer, and learned that none other of Ashlock's crew except the one before mentioned had been saved. But, on the contrary, the captain of the steamer had sent one of his own boats to their rescue, which was likewise upset in the surf, and, out of the 3 men in her, one had drifted back outside of the breakers, clinging to the upturned boat, and was picked up. This sad and fatal catastrophe made us all afraid of that bar, and in returning to the shore I adopted the more prudent course of beaching the boat below the inlet, which ensured a good ducking, but was attended with less risk to life. I had to return to the fort and bear Mrs. Ashlock the absolute truth that her husband was lost forever. Meantime, her sister had entirely recovered her equilibrium, and being the guest of the officers, who were extremely courteous to her, she did not lament so loudly the calamity that saved them a long life of banishment on the beach of an Indian river. By the first opportunity they were sent back to St. Augustine, the possessors of all of Ashlock's worldly goods and effects, consisting of a good rifle, several cast nets, hand lines, etc., etc., besides some $300 in money, which was due to him by the quartermaster for his services as pilot. I afterward saw the ladies at St. Augustine, and years afterward the younger one came to Charleston, South Carolina, the wife of a somewhat famous Captain Thistle, agent for the United States for Live Oak in Florida, who was noted as the first of the troublesome class of inventors of modern artillery. He was the inventor of a gun that did not recoil at all, or, if anything, it recoiled a little forward. One day in the summer of 1841, the sentinel on the housetop at Fort Pierce called out, "Indians! Indians!" Everyone sprang to his gun. The companies formed promptly on the parade ground, and soon were reported as approaching the post, from the pine woods in rear, 4 Indians on horseback. They rode straight up to the gateway, dismounted, and came in. They were conducted by the officer of the day to the commanding officer, Major Childs, who sat on the porch in front of his own room. After the usual pause, one of them, a black man named Joe, who spoke English, said they had been sent in by Cocucci, Wildcat, one of the most noted of the Seminole chiefs, to see the big chief of the post. He gradually unwrapped a piece of paper, which was passed over to Major Childs, who read it, and it was in the nature of a safeguard for Wildcat to come into Fort Pierce to receive provisions and assistance while collecting his tribe with the purpose of emigrating to the reservation west of Arkansas. The paper was signed by General Worth, who had succeeded General Taylor at Tampa Bay, in command of all the troops in Florida. Major Childs inquired, "Where is Cocucci?" and was answered, "Close by," when Joe explained that he had been sent in by his chief to see if the paper was all right. Major Childs said it was all right, and that Cocucci ought to come himself. Joe offered to go out and bring him in, when Major Childs ordered me to take 8 or 10 mounted men and go out to escort him in. Detailing 10 men to saddle up and taking Joe and 1 Indian boy along on their own ponies, I started out under their guidance. We continued to ride for 5 or 6 miles when I began to suspect treachery, of which I had heard so much in former years and had been especially cautioned against by the older officers. But Joe always answered, "Only a little away." At last we approached one of those close hammocks, so well known in Florida, standing like an island in the interminable pine forest, with a pond of water near it. On its edge I noticed a few Indians loitering, which Joe pointed out as the place. Apprehensive of treachery, I halted the guard, gave order to the sergeant to watch me closely, and rode forward alone with the 2 Indian guides. As we neared the hammock, about a dozen Indian warriors rose up and waited for us. When in their midst I inquired for the chief Cocucci. He approached my horse, and slapping his breast, said, "Me Cocucci." He was a very handsome young Indian warrior, not more than 25 years old, but in his then dress could hardly be distinguished from the rest. I then explained to him through Joe that I had been sent by my chief, to escort him into the fort. He wanted me to get down and talk. I told him that I had no talk in me, but that, on his reaching the post, he could talk as much as he pleased with the big chief, Major Childs. They all seemed to be indifferent and in no hurry, and I noticed all their guns were leaning against a tree. I beckoned to the sergeant, who advanced rapidly with his escort, and told him to secure the rifles, which he proceeded to do. Kokuchi pretended to be very angry, but I explained to him that his warriors were tired and mine were not, and that the soldiers would carry the guns on their horses. I told him I would provide him a horse to ride, and the sooner he was ready, the better for all. He then stripped, washed himself in the pond, and began to dress in all his Indian finery, which consisted of a buckskin leggings, moccasins, and several shirts. He then began to put on vests, one after another, and one of them had marks of a bullet, just above the pocket, with the stain of blood. In the pocket was a $1 Tallahassee banknote, and the rascal had the impudence to ask me to give him a silver coin for that dollar. He had evidently killed the wearer, and was disappointed because the pocket contained a paper dollar instead of one in silver. In due time he was dressed with turban and ostrich feathers, and mounted the horse reserved for him, and thus we rode back together to Fort Pierce. Major Childs and all the other officers received him on the porch, and there we had a regular talk. Kokuchi was tired of the war. His people were scattered, and it would take a moon to collect them for emigration, and he wanted rations for that time, etc., etc. All this was agreed to, and a month was allowed for him to get ready with his whole band, numbering some 150 or 160, to migrate. The talk then ceased, and Kokuchi and his envoys proceeded to get regularly drunk, which was easily done by the agency of commissary whiskey. They stayed at Fort Pierce during the night, and the next day departed. Several times during the month there came into the post 2 or more of the same Indians, always to beg for something to eat or drink. And after a full month, Kokuchi and about 20 of his warriors arrived with several ponies, but with none of their women and children. Major Childs had not from the beginning the least faith in his sincerity, had made up his mind to seize the whole party and compel them to emigrate. He arranged for the usual council, and instructed Lieutenant Taylor to invite Kokuchi and his uncle, who had held to be a principal chief, to his room to take some good brandy, instead of the common commissary whiskey. At a signal agreed on, I was to go about the quarters of Company A, to dispatch the first sergeant and another man to Lieutenant Taylor's room, there to seize the 2 chiefs and secure them, and with the company I was to enter Major Child's room and secure the remainder of the party. Meantime, Lieutenant Van Villay was ordered to go to the quarters of his Company F, and at the same signal to march rapidly to the rear of the officers' quarters, so as to catch any who might attempt to escape by the open windows to the rear. All resulted exactly as prearranged, and in a few minutes the whole party was in irons. At first they claimed that we had acted treacherously, but very soon they admitted that for a month Kokuchi had been quietly moving his women and children to Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades, and that this visit to our post was to have been their last. It so happened that almost at the instant of our seizing these Indians, a vessel arrived off the bar with reinforcements from St. Augustine. These were brought up to Fort Pierce, and we marched that night and next day rapidly, some 50 miles, to Lake Okeechobee, in hopes to capture the balance of the tribe, especially the families, but they had taken the alarm and escaped. Kokuchi and his warriors were sent by Major Childs in a schooner to New Orleans en route to their reservation, but General Worth had recalled them to Tampa Bay, and by sending out Kokuchi himself, the women and children came involuntarily, and then all were shipped towards their destination. This was a heavy loss to the Seminoles, but there still remained in the peninsula a few hundred warriors with their families scattered into very small parcels, who were concealed in the most inaccessible hammocks and swamps. These had no difficulty in finding plenty of food anywhere and everywhere. Deer and wild turkey were abundant, and as for fish, there was no end to them. Indeed, Florida was the Indians' paradise, was of little value to us, and it was a great pity to remove the Seminoles at all, for we could have collected these Choctaws, Creeks, Cherokees, and Chickasaws in addition to the Seminoles. They would have thrived in the peninsula, whereas they now occupy lands that are very valuable, which are coveted by their white neighbors on all sides, while the peninsula of Florida still remains with a population less than should make a good state. During that and preceding years, General W.S. Harney had penetrated and crossed through the Everglades, capturing and hanging Chiquita and his band, and had brought in many prisoners who were also shipped west. We at Fort Pierce made several other excursions to Jupiter, Lake Worth, Lauderdale, and into the Everglades, picking up here and there a family, so that it was absurd any longer to call it a war. These excursions, however, possessed to us a peculiar charm, for the fragrance of the air, the abundance of game and fish, and just enough of adventure gave to life a relish. I had just returned to Lauderdale from one of these scouts with Lieutenant Rankin, Ord, George H. Thomas, Field, Van Vliet, and others, when I received notice of my promotion to be First Lieutenant of Company G, which occurred November 30th, 1841, and I was ordered to return to Fort Pierce, turn over the public property for which I was accountable to Lieutenant H.S. Burton, and then to join my new company at St. Augustine. I reached St. Augustine before Christmas and was assigned to command a detachment of 20 men stationed at Picolata on the St. Johns River, 18 miles distant. As St. Augustine were still the headquarters of the regiment, Colonel William Gates with Company E, Lieutenant Bragg, and Company G, Lieutenant H.B. Judd, the only buildings at Picolata, were the one occupied by my detachment, which had been built for a hospital, and the dwelling of a family named Williams, with whom I boarded. On the other hand, St. Augustine had many pleasant families, among those whom was prominent United States Judge Bronson. I was half my time in St. Augustine or on the road, and remembered the old place with pleasure. In February we received orders transferring the whole regiment to the Gulf posts, and our company, G, was ordered to escort Colonel Gates and his family across the Suwannee River en route for Pensacola. The company, with the colonel and his family, reached Picolata, where my detachment joined, and we embarked in a steamboat for Pilitaka. Here Lieutenant Judd discovered that he had forgotten something and had to return to St. Augustine, so that I commanded the company on the march, having with me Second Lieutenant George B. Ayres. Our first march was to Fort Russell, then Micanopy, Wakahuta, and the Wacasees, all of which posts were garrisoned by the 2nd or 7th Infantry. At Wacasees we met General Worth and his staff, en route for Pilatka. Lieutenant Judd overtook us about the Suwannee, where we embarked on a small boat for Cedar Keys, and there took a larger one for Pensacola, where the colonel and his family landed, and our company proceeded on in the same vessel to our post, Fort Morgan, Mobile Point. The fort had not been occupied by troops for many years, was very dirty, and was found little or no stores there. Major Ogden, of the engineers, occupied a house outside the fort. I was quartermaster and commissary, and, taking advantage of one of the engineer's schooners, engaged in bringing materials for the fort. I went up to Mobile City, and, through the agency of the Messrs. Deschamps, Taylor, and Mayers, merchants, procured all essentials for the troops, and returned to the post. In the course of a week or 10 days arrived another company, H, commanded by Lieutenant James Ketchum and Lieutenants Rankin and Sewall L. Fish, and an assistant surgeon, Wells. Ketchum became the commanding officer and Lieutenant Rankin quartermaster. We proceeded to put the post in as good order as possible. I had regular guard mounting and parades, but little drill. We found magnificent fishing with the seine on the outer beach, and sometimes in a single haul we would take 10 or 15 barrels of the best kind of fish, embracing pompanos, redfish, snappers, etc. We remained there till June, when the regiment was ordered to exchange from the Gulf posts to those of the Atlantic, extending from Savannah to North Carolina. The brig Wetumpka was chartered, and our company, G, embarked and sailed to Pensacola, where we took on board another company, D, Burke's, commanded by Lieutenant H.S. Burton, with Colonel Gates, the regimental headquarters, and some families. From Pensacola we sailed to Charleston, South Carolina. The weather was hot, the winds light, and we made long passage, but at last reached Charleston harbor, disembarked, and took post in Fort Moultrie. Soon after, 2 other companies arrived to Bragg's B and Keyes K. The 2 former companies were already quartered inside of Fort Moultrie, and these latter were placed in gun sheds outside, which were altered into barracks. We remained at Fort Moultrie nearly 5 years, until the Mexican War scattered us forever. Our life there was of strict garrison duty. We soon formed many and most pleasant acquaintances in the city of Charleston, and it so happened that many of the families resided at Sullivan's Island in the summer season, where we could reciprocate the hospitalities extended to us in the winter. During the summer of 1843, having been continuously on duty for 3 years, I applied for and received a leave of absence for 3 months, which I spent mostly in Ohio. In November I started to return to my post at Charleston by ways of New Orleans, took the stage to Chillicothe, Ohio, November 16th, having Henry Stanbury, Esquire, and wife as traveling companions. We continued by stage next day to Portsmouth, Ohio. At Portsmouth, Mr. Stanbury took a boat up the river, and I one down to Cincinnati. There I found my brothers Lamson and Hoyt employed in the Gazette printing office, and spent much time with them and Charles Anderson, Esquire, visiting his brother Lars, Mr. Longworth, some of his artist friends, and especially Miss Sale Carnell, then quite a belle, and noted for her fine voice. On the 20th I took passage on the steamboat Manhattan for St. Louis. Reached Louisville, where Dr. Conrad of the Army joined me, and in the Manhattan we continued on to St. Louis, with a mixed crowd. We reached the Mississippi at Cairo the 23rd, and St. Louis Friday, November 24th, 1843. At St. Louis we called on Colonel S. W. Kearney and Major Cooper, his adjutant general, and found my classmate, Lieutenant McNutt, of the Ordnance, stationed at the arsenal, also Mr. Deas, an artist, and Pacificus Ord, who was studying law. I spent a week at St. Louis, visiting the arsenal, Jefferson Barracks, and most places of interest, and then became impressed with its great future. It then contained about 40,000 people, and my notes described 36 good steamboats receiving and discharging cargo at the levee. I took passage December 4th in the steamer John Owl for New Orleans. As we passed Cairo, the snow was falling, and the country was wintry and devoid of verdure. Gradually, however, as we proceeded south, the green color came, grass and trees showed the change of latitude, and when in the course of a week we had reached New Orleans, the roses were in full bloom, the sugar cane just ripe, and a tropical air prevalent. We reached New Orleans December 11th, 1843, where I spent about a week visiting the barracks then occupied by the 7th Infantry, the theaters, hotels, and all the usual places of interest that day. On the 16th of December I continued on to Mobile in the steamer fashion by way of Lake Pontchartrain. Saw there most of my personal friends, Mr. and Mrs. Bull, Judge Bragg, and his brothers Dunbar, Dishon, Taylor, and Myers, etc., and on the 19th of December took a passage in the steamer boat Bourbon for Montgomery, Alabama, by way of the Alabama River. We reached Montgomery at noon, December 23rd, and took cars at 1 p.m. for Franklin, 40 miles, which we reached at 7 p.m. Then stages for Griffin, Georgia, via Lagrange and Greenville. This took the whole night of the 23rd and the day of the 24th. At Griffin we took cars for Macon, and thence to Savannah, which we reached Christmas night, finding Lieutenants Ridgely and Ketchum at tea, where we soon joined by Rankin and Beckwith. On the 26th, I took the boat for Charleston, reaching my post and reported for duty Wednesday morning, December 27, 1843. I had hardly got back to my post when, on the 21st of January, 1844, I received from Lieutenant R.P. Hammond at Marriott, Georgia, an intimation that Colonel Churchill, Inspector General of the Army, had applied for me to assist him in taking dispositions in Upper Georgia and Alabama concerning certain losses by volunteers in Florida of horses and equipment by reason of the failure of the United States to provide sufficient forage, and for which Congress had made appropriation. On the 4th of February, the order came from the Adjutant General in Washington for me to proceed to Marietta, Georgia, and report to Inspector General Churchill. I was delayed till the 14th of February by reason of being on a court-martial, when I was duly relieved and started to rail to Augusta, Georgia, and as far as Madison, where I took the mail coach, reaching Marietta on the 17th. There I reported for duty to Colonel Churchill, who was already engaged of his work, assisted by Lieutenant R.P. Hammond, 3rd Artillery, and a citizen named Stockton. The colonel had his family with him, consisting of Mrs. Churchill, Mary, now Mrs. Professor Baird, and Charles Churchill, then a boy of about 15 years of age. We all lived in a tavern and had an office convenient. The duty consisted in taking individual depositions of the officers and men who had composed 2 regiments and a battalion of mounted volunteers that had served in Florida. An oath was administered to each man by Colonel Churchill, who then turned the claimant over to one of us to take down and record his deposition according to certain forms, which enabled them to be consolidated and tabulated. We remained in Marietta about 6 weeks, during which time I repeatedly rode to Kennesaw Mountain and over the very ground where afterward, in 1864, we had some hard battles. After closing our business at Marietta, the colonel ordered us to transfer our operations to Bellefonte, Alabama. As he proposed to take his family and party by stage, Hammond lent me his riding horse, which I rode to Allatoona and the Etowah River. Hearing of certain large Indian mounds near the way, I turned to one side to visit them, stopping a couple of days with Colonel Lewis Tumlin, on whose plantation these mounds were. We struck up such an acquaintance that we corresponded for some years, and as I passed his plantation during the war in 1864, I inquired for him, but he was not at home. From Tumlin's I rode to Rome, and by way of Will's Valley over Sand Mountain and the Raccoon Range to the Tennessee River at Bellefonte, Alabama, we all assembled there in March and continued our works for nearly 2 months, when, having completed the business, Colonel Churchill with his family went north by way of Nashville, Hammond, Stockton, and I returning south on horseback by Rome, Allatoona, Marietta, Atlanta, and Madison, Georgia. Stockton stopped at Marietta, where he resided. Hammond took the cars at Madison, and I rode alone to Augusta, Georgia, where I left the horse and returned to Charleston and Fort Moultrie by rail. Thus, by a mere accident, I was enabled to traverse on horseback the very ground where in after years I had to conduct vast armies and fight great battles. That the knowledge thus acquired was of infinite use to me, and consequently to the government, I have always felt and stated. During the autumn of 1844, a difficulty arose among the officers of Company B, 3rd Artillery, John R. Vinton's, garrisoning Augusta Arsenal, and I was sent up from Fort Moultrie as a sort of peacemaker. After staying there some months, certain transfers of officers were made, and I returned to my post, Fort Moultrie. During that winter, 1844-45, I was visiting at the plantation of Mr. Poyas, on the east branch of the Cooper, about 50 miles from Fort Moultrie, hunting deer with his son James and Lieutenant John F. Reynolds, 3rd Artillery. We had taken our stands, and a deer came out of the swamp near that of Mr. James Poyas, who fired, broke the leg of the deer, which turned into the swamp and came out again above mine. I could follow his course by the cry of the hounds, which were in close pursuit. Hastily mounting my horse, I struck across the pine woods to head the deer off, and when at full career my horse leaped a fallen log, and his forefoot caught one of those hard, unyielding pine knots had brought him with violence to the ground. I got up as quick as possible and found my right arm out of place of the shoulder, caused by the weight of the double-barreled gun. Seeing Reynolds at some distance, I called out lustily and brought him to me. He soon mended the bridle and saddle, which had been broken by the fall, helped me on my horse, and we followed the course of the hounds. At first my arm did not pain me much, but it soon began to ache, so that it was almost unendurable. In about 3 miles we came to the negro hut, where I got off and rested till Reynolds could overtake Poyas and bring him back. They came at last, but by the time the arm was so swollen and painful that I could not ride. They rigged up an old gig belonging to the negro, in which I was carried 6 miles to the plantation of Mr. Poyas, Sr. A neighboring physician was sent for me, who tried the usual method of setting the arm, but without success, each time making the operation more painful. At last he sent off, got a set of double pulleys and cords, with which he succeeded in extending the muscles in getting the bone into place. I have returned to Fort Moultrie, but being disabled, applied for short leave and went north. I started January 25th, 1845, went to Washington, Baltimore, and Lancaster, Ohio, whence I went to Mansfield, and thence back to Newark, to Wheeling, Cumberland, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, whence I sailed back for Charleston on the ship Sullivan, reaching Fort Moultrie March 9th, 1845. About that time, March 1st, 1845, Congress had, by joint resolution, provided for the annexation of Texas, then an independent republic, subject to certain conditions requiring the acceptance of the Republic of Texas to be final and conclusive. We all expected war as a matter of course. At that time, General Zachary Taylor had assembled a couple of regiments of infantry and one of dragoons at Fort Jessup, Louisiana, and had orders to extend military protection to Texas against Indians or a foreign enemy, the moment the terms of annexation were accepted. He received notice of such acceptance July 7th, and forthwith proceeded to remove his troops to Corpus Christi, Texas, where during the summer and fall of 1845 was assembled the sense with which in spring of 1846 was begun the Mexican War. Sometime during the summer came to Fort Moultrie orders for sending Company E, 3rd Artillery, Lieutenant Bragg, to New Orleans, there to receive a battery of field guns, and thence to the camp of General Taylor at Corpus Christi. This was the first company of our regiment sent to the seat of war, and it embarked on the brig Hayne. This was the only company that left Fort Moultrie till after I was detached for recruiting service on the 1st of May, 1846. Inasmuch as Charleston afterward became famous as the spot where began our Civil War, a general description of it, as it was in 1846, will not be out of place. The city lies on a long peninsula between the Ashley and Cooper rivers, a low, level peninsula of sand. Meeting Street is its Broadway, with King Street next west and parallel, the street of shops and small stores. These streets are crossed at right angles by many others, of which Broad Street was the principal, and the intersection of Meeting and Broad was the heart of the city, marked by the guardhouse and St. Michael's Episcopalian Church. The custom house, post office, etc., were at the foot of Broad Street, near the wharves of the Cooper River front. At the extremity of the peninsula was a drive, open to the bay, and faced by some of the handsomest houses of that city, called the Battery. Looking down the bay on the right was James Island, an irregular triangle of about 7 miles, the whole island in cultivation with Sea Island cotton. At the lower end was Fort Johnson, then simply the station of Captain Bowman, United States Engineers, engaged in building Fort Sumter. This fort, Sumter, was erected on an artificial island nearly in mid-channel, made by dumping rocks, mostly brought as ballast in cotton ships from the north. As the rocks reached the surface it was leveled, and made the foundation of Fort Sumter. In 1846 this fort was barely above the water. Still farther out beyond James Island, and separated from it with a wide space of salt marsh, with crooked channels, was Morris Island, composed of the sand dunes thrown up by the wind and the sea, backed with the salt marsh. Of this was the lighthouse, but no people. On the left, looking down the bay from the battery of Charleston, was first Castle Pinckney, a round brick fort of 2 tiers of guns, one in embrasure, the other in barbette, built on a marsh island which was not garrisoned. Farther down the bay, a point of the mainland reached the bay, where there was a group of houses called Mount Pleasant, and at extremity of the bay, distant 6 miles, was Sullivan's Island, presently a smooth sand beach to the sea, with the line of sand hills or dunes thrown up by the waves and winds, and the usual backing of marsh and crooked saltwater channels. At the shoulder of this island was Fort Moultrie, an irregular fort without ditch or counterscarp. with a brick scarp wall about 12 feet high, which could be scaled anywhere, and this was surmounted by an earth parapet capable of mounting about 40 24 and 32-pounder smooth-bore iron guns. Inside the fort were 3 two-story brick barracks, sufficient to quarter the officers and the men of 2 companies of artillery. At sea was the usual bar, changing slightly from year to year, but generally the main ship channel came from the south, parallel to Morris Island, till it was well up to Fort Moultrie, where it curved, passing close to Fort Sumter and up the wharves of the city, which were built mostly along the Cooper River front. Charleston was then a proud, aristocratic city, and assumed a leadership in the public opinion of the South far out of proportion to her population, wealth, and commerce. On more than one occasion previously, the inhabitants had almost inaugurated civil war by their assertion and professed belief that each state had, in original compact of government, reserved to itself the right to withdraw from the Union at its own option, whenever the people supposed by they had sufficient cause. We used to discuss these things at our own mess tables, vehemently and sometimes quite angrily, but I am sure that I never feared it would go further than it had already gone in the winter of 1832-33, when the attempt at nullification was promptly suppressed by President Jackson's famous declaration, "The Union must and shall be preserved," and by judicious management of General Scott. Still, civil war was to be, and, now that it has come and gone, we can rest secure in the knowledge that as the chief cause, slavery, had been eradicated forever, it is not likely to come again.